Hey, I'm Father Roderick, and I'm back with a follow-up video to my analysis of Chapter 2 of the Book of Boba Fett. Now, I posted that video on the same day that the episode aired, and as you can imagine, a lot of people chimed in the comments section. I did a lot of extra reading, and of course, other YouTubers and other Star Wars fans were chiming in with what they discovered in the episode, some background information. There were some tidbits coming from interviews that were given around this episode. So there's a lot I want to share with you, additional insight on a number of very important topics. Of course, we have to talk a little more about the theme of slavery, exploitation, imperialism, and what this episode actually mirrors in our real history. We have to talk about a recurring theme that is very much George Lucas and also to a lesser extent Tolkien, which is nature versus technology. In this episode, it comes to the forefront in a very obvious way. I want to talk a bit more about Trandoshans and Wookiees, and especially, of course, about that dangerous black Wookiee that we got to see, that we got a glimpse of in this episode, and I undoubtedly think we're going to see more of him later on. We have to talk about why the Gamorrean Guards are actually bare-chested. That is different from Return of the Jedi. I now know why that is. We, of course, need to also dive into the train scenes. I discovered what these train scenes and what this whole sequence was actually based on visually. There is another movie that has a very, very similar sequence in it. We need to talk about the Pyke Syndicate. I want to talk a little bit about the casino, the sanctuary, about the huts, and we need to talk a whole bunch more about Tusken culture and especially about the rituals that we see in the last part of the episode. The tree sequence, the dream sequence, there is actually much more to that sequence than I initially thought. And of course we want to talk also a little bit about all the cultural influences from our real world that have been integrated, I think, very, very well in this episode of the Book of Boba Fett. All that and more coming up right now in this episode. First of all, I want to thank all of you that have contributed in the comments, and I encourage you to continue to do that. It's a ton of fun for me as a YouTuber to go and read your comments and to discover all sorts of new tidbits. I feel like the golden era of Star Wars is back, at least in my life, because this is what I've always enjoyed the most about Star Wars. It's not just the experience of watching a cool movie, or in this case, a very, very cool, almost theater-worthy episode on TV, but it's to talk about it with fellow fans and to speculate and to get all excited and, start to come up with, what will happen next and where do you think they're going with this and this. So to be able to do that with you in the form of these videos and then afterwards in the comments, thank you so much for engaging. And I will also mention a number of you in this video today because I think your contribution to the reflection on this episode has been very, very valuable. I want to start with a follower called King, although the I is a number 1. And he says, the title, the Tribes of Tatooine, and your idea that this may have been inspired by the tribes of Israel is very interesting because this is not only something from Christianity, but this is also something you encounter in the Quran. And that's exactly true because, of course, both Judaism and Christianity and the Quran, so Islamic faith, all go back to the tradition of Abraham and the Abrahamic texts. That all narrate these events with Moses and the tribes and everything. There are a few differences, nuances. For instance, in the Quran, in the story. The Quran, of course, was written in the 7th century, beginning of the 7th century, probably, and is mostly based on the same traditions that Christianity was inspired by centuries earlier. And so there are differences. Notably in the version of the Quran, the tribes of Israel emerge during the journey through the desert. So it is while they are already in the desert that things start to fall apart or at least start to split up. And this happens more specifically in the moment that they're all thirsty. And then Moses, remember there's this story where everybody's thirsty and complaining that God is not helping them. And then Moses takes his staff and he hits a rock, and then water streams from the rock. A very strong symbol of course, this new life that God has in store for his thirsty people. But in the version of the Quran, there are 12 sources that spring from the rock, one for each tribe. In the original scripture of the Judaic and the Christian tradition, the actual emergence of the 12 tribes starts with Jacob. He has 12 sons. I think I've already discussed this in the previous video. So every son gets to head one of those tribes, and it is Moses who actually unites those tribes, and together they go through the desert. So what you see is that the writers of this episode have carefully studied these, or studied it, probably didn't do it on purpose. It's just part of their, narrative knowledge. They took those stories from all these three Abrahamic religions, and mirrored that in the story of Boba Fett, who is like another Moses in a certain way, and it is going to be his job, his quest, his vocation to bring these different tribes of Tatooine together. And in a certain way, if you think that Moses was the one who made sure that these people got water, the symbol of life, the water is a very strong symbolic element in this episode as well. And in a certain way, I think that Boba Fett is also helping these poor, thirsty people that have been exploited for many centuries by all sorts of external forces to find their own sources of water. It's right there in the land that they actually have ancestral rights to. And so there is a very, very strong, biblical, Islamic connotation in this story of Boba Fett. And that's, as part of its appeal. That's why so many of us can relate to what they're trying to do with this Book of Boba Fett. Of course, and another thing I forgot to mention is that not only do these 12 tribes of Israel are they important in the Old Testament, but Jesus kind of takes the same symbolism, and in the similar way that the writers here put it in their story, Jesus did the same. He took that whole imagery of those 12 tribes and he transposed it onto his 12 apostles. And he said, you guys, you are going to be the new leaders who have to help my people to reach the promised land. You will be the ones who will guide them through the desert of their existence and in this arid world, and point them to the sources of everlasting life. And so again, you see that the title is much more important and has much more weight than I initially thought. Let's go to the whole theme of slavery and freedom. Of course, fundamental themes in a lot of these old scriptures that we nurture and cherish as mankind. There is something that in a lot of our stories that we love, even the rooting for the underdog. Why do we do that so often? It's because we love stories of the oppressed who then rise up from their ashes and fight their way to become stronger, and they are now in charge. They take the lead. There is something that appeals to us because we can relate to that. It's so much part of human history. We've known so many of these eras where people oppressed each other, and then the weak and the exploited were finally able to wrestle free. And in a certain way, in this day and age, we're in the middle of such one of those big cultural movements where certain groups in our society, certain cultural groups, are now coming to the forefront, and they are no longer afraid to show who they are and what life they have chosen or how they identify themselves. And as always, that comes with a lot of cultural and social unrest, and people are like, well, what is all this new stuff, all these new thoughts, and you get old versus new, etc. I'm thinking this has been part of mankind since the beginning of our existence. This is how we grow. It is by slowly acknowledging that people who have been oppressed, who have been pushed away to the margins of society, as Pope Francis likes to say, these people also have the right to belong. They are part of the human family. They too have the right to be there as they are. And, you know, in a certain way, Star Wars is part of that cultural change and is mirroring it like all good stories do in their time. They're not just stories. They're always also about us. And that is why, you know, we want to read these, because it can help us understand the times that we live in. So, slavery and the opposite of that, or let's say the cause of slavery, imperialism, dominance of foreign entities over the people to exploit them for their labor or the riches of their land. That has been part of human history for forever. And this chapter is clearly a metaphor of our own history, and more specifically about the situation that many indigenous people, the Native Americans, but I've also got a lot of reactions from people from Australia, from New Zealand, that tell me, you know, in our countries it's exactly the same. We're only now starting to see what our ancestors, what our, you know, grandfathers have done in the past. And you have to keep in mind that in Australia, just the right to vote was just given to the Aboriginals in, I think, in the 70s of the last century. So we're not talking about ancient history. It took centuries for people to finally start to realize what they have done to these original inhabitants of these countries. And so we're only now starting to process and also to having to deal with that legacy and trying to find a way forward that no longer oppresses these peoples. So it was very cool to see how much this episode resonated, not just in the United States, but also in Australia and also in New Zealand, not just with the, let's say, the descendants of the Western people that migrated there, but also with a lot of Star Wars fans that are actually part of the Aboriginals, or, you know, groups that come from the Maori. And let's not forget that Temuera Morrison, the actor who plays Boba Fett, is himself a Maori from New Zealand. So for him, this story is also about his identity. And I think that makes it so much stronger and having so much more impact than if he had, you know, Boba Fett had just been played by, you know, any other actor. Jeremy in the comments made a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment. He said, if only Boba Fett would have forced the Sand People to accept his God as their Lord and Savior. So he's kind of pointing to what a lot of, you know, Christian people have done in the past, where they travel to other countries, other continents, and then kind of forced them to take on Christianity, and forced not only their culture but also their faith upon them. And there are two sides to this. Of course, missionary work can be understood as we are sharing something of our culture in the hope that it enriches and helps the lives of the people that we encounter. I mean, as a priest, I do that all the time. It's what I do also on YouTube. You know, I share what is valuable to me and important to me. I share that with you. But there is a whole ocean between sharing it and offering it and imposing it and enforcing it. And that is, of course, what Jeremy means. You know, this could have been a really nasty story. And then I replied, you know what, in a way, this has always been part of Star Wars, this theme of slavery and oppression. And it starts with Anakin Skywalker on Tatooine. He and his mother were owned by the Hutts. It names them even specifically. And it's all about the Jedi intervening. The Jedi, in a certain way, are monks. They represent a certain religion. But they are not there to just have everyone believe in the Force. But the Force, their own beliefs, make them act socially. Their faith instructs them to go free these slaves. And so you see that the light side of the Force is constantly a force for good, and is trying to motivate those that are Force sensitive to go in the world and help people and liberate them from the clutches of the dark side. That, I think, is the core of what Star Wars is about. And it's an important lesson for us as well. Religion is never supposed to be a weapon to subjugate other people, to force them into thinking like you do, but it should be a motivating force, pun intended, to help you improve the world and to make the world as God intended, or in Star Wars terms, as the light side of the Force would do. And but it should never be used as a weapon. So the Empire in Star Wars was already, for decades, the symbol in the Star Wars universe of that oppression, of imperialism. Look at Tarkin and his way of thinking. It's just by power. He tries to keep all these planets and systems in his grip. And it is Leia who is much more modern in her thinking, and she tells him, the more you tighten your grip, the more will slip from your fingers like sand. And she's right, of course, we know this. But the Empire is clearly, in many ways, a mirror of the way in which a lot of our Western countries have behaved in the past, and maybe are still behaving, because let's not forget that slavery, exploitation, all sorts of human traffic are still with us today. So it's not just something of the past. We too are to be like Boba Fett and do something about it instead of minding our own business, And then of course you've got the Empire in Star Wars, and then you always have the other parties that benefit from that presence. So you've got the Hutts, who collaborate in a certain way. They use the system and the oppression by the Empire to make sure that they make a profit, just like in the Bible. You see, you've got the Romans who are oppressing Israel at the time, occupying Israel and forcing them to pay taxes and everything. But then you also have all these other parties that are collaborating. Even some of Jesus' followers originally were working with the Romans to help exploit their fellow Hebrews. I mean, yeah, this story of Boba Fett is also our story. Nature and technology, the second topic I wanted to dive into. This is something that I read in some of the comments, where I was reminded of the fact that at one point the Tuskens, who are starting to realize, well, wait a minute, we've always thought about ourselves in history as, we have to step away from all this strife between all these different tribes on Tatooine. We need to scurry away. We need to stay at a distance. And Boba Fett tells them, no, you are warriors. You should stand up. You should be with me, and let's do something about this. And then the Tuskens reply, or their first thought is, but they have machines. They're so much more powerful. They're technologically much more advanced than we are. Who are we to combat an enemy like that? And then Boba says, but you know every grain of sand. And that, for me, immediately also evoked what the Force is about. The Force, when Yoda explains it, and later on Luke Skywalker, when he explains it to Rey, it's this force that connects every little thing, even the small plants and the organisms, and it's in between the grains of sand. And Boba Fett, even though this is not about the Force at all, but he understands that. He understands that the strength of these Tusken Raiders is that they know the land that is theirs. And that knowledge of nature and that, intrinsic connection with the environment will give them the edge over this invading technology that may look strong, but ultimately will lose from this knowledge in a certain way. This is very much George Lucas. He has said that multiple times, and I think he got it from great writers like J.R.R. Tolkien, which is a recurring theme in The Lord of the Rings. It's nature versus industrialization. This was very much happening while Tolkien was alive, all these bigger cities and industry that started to also destroy and exploit nature. He was very skeptical against it, very worried about those developments. And that is why in the Lord of the Rings saga, you see that reflected in Saruman, who is, building his armies, and he's destroying literally entire forests to build his machines of destruction. And it looks like he's way more powerful than these, few hobbits and this one elf and dwarf and this strange, crazy wizard. But you will see later on that nature, with the help of the Ents, for instance, that is one of my favorite sequences in The Lord of the Rings. These Ents, ancient nature, stands up and, rises up against this destructive nature of industrialism, and ultimately end up destroying that entire, palace or the tower of Saruman. And George Lucas, in many interviews, has said that in his stories he wants to do the same. He wants to juxtapose, on the one hand, you've got the Force and what it stands for, this connecting energy that binds the universe together, that helps people and things grow and develop. And then you've got the Empire, who through technology and military force and violence tries to destroy it in order to control it. And there are a few examples, of course, in the stories that we know. You've got the Ewoks versus the Empire. These little fluffy bears. What are they going to do against these ATSTs that are walking through the forest and can shoot at everything that moves? Well, these Ewoks, they know the forest. They know how to use nature. Remember the scene with the ATST and then these two these two trees that completely crash the ATST. That, for me, is a perfect reflection of nature versus machines, and nature actually being much stronger than you think. And also in the prequels, when George Lucas was making the Phantom Menace, he said that the entire final battle between the Gungans and the army of battle droids, that was the same theme. That was nature against technology. You've got all those tanks and everything and all the technology and all these robots. And then you've got these Gungans who live underwater and everything is organic in their world, and yet they are, even though they may seem like clowns sometimes, but they still manage to vanquish and to be strong against the technology, the imperial, not the imperial, but the army that is threatening them. So it's nice to see that also in this story coming to the foreground. It is nature versus technology. You've got the train, you've got all that power, the huts that are using everything they have to destroy and to exploit, and then you have on the other side all these tribes that are now finally discovering, thanks to Boba Fett's leadership, they're much stronger because they've got nature on their side. Let's go to the Trandoshans versus the Wookiees. This is another thing that I learned from one of you that posted in the comments. Nautilus 1972 says the Trandoshans actually hate Wookiees. So I'm pretty sure that Boba Fett is going to team up with them. I remember I was a bit like taking the opposite idea. Like we see these Trandoshans when Boba and Fennec are walking to the city hall. And I was like, ooh, they actually might be behind this whole plot of trying to attack Boba Fett. But then I remembered that the leader of the Trandoshans comes to Boba's palace and offers him a tribute in the form of a very gruesome pelt of a Wookiee, which could also be a sign that now that there is a dangerous Wookiee, an evil Wookiee on the block, that Boba Fett may actually need the help of these Trandoshans and their common fear or animosity versus this very dangerous Wookiee will help them unite. I think it's a very interesting idea. M11RRRS, no idea how you pronounce that, says, I predict that Boba will recruit the Trandoshans to help with the Wookiee gladiator. Who knows? Who knows? I'll get back to the Wookiee gladiator later on, but first I need to talk about the new Gamorrean Guards. When I was watching this episode, again, I was like, these Gamorrean Guards are so much stronger and leaner than, their family that we saw in the Return of the Jedi. They were so super overweight and bulky with all those harnesses and everything. You can never really take them seriously as guards. But in fact, the Gamorrean Guards that we see in the Book of Boba Fett, with their, bare-chested and still heavy, but agile and dangerous and very, very obedient in a way they just do whatever Boba says they do. They execute. This is actually how George Lucas initially envisioned the Gamorrean Guards. There are sketches in a book that was published in 1983, which was the Return of the Jedi sketchbook, shows sketches of Gamorreans in the way that they are depicted in this chapter, bare-chested. And they were wearing more gladiator-style or costumes, so not the full armor that we see in Return of the Jedi. There was a problem. In order to make bare-chested gladiators, you need to have a convincing green, upper body. And back then, the technology couldn't do seamless costumes. And so the rubber that they used for the muscles and the chest of the Gamorreans showed a very clear separation between the arms and the shoulders and the rest of the body. And George Lucas, because he's very hands-on when it comes to the way everything looks in the movie, he decided, you know what, this is not good enough. Let's give them some armor so we can cover up those seams. That is why they wear that bulky armor. Nowadays, of course, there's so much advancement when it comes to making these prosthetics that there was no problem making these Gamorrean Guards bare-chested as George Lucas originally envisioned. That's what I love about these newer television series. They often go back to the original ideas, just like to the designs of Ralph McQuarrie. I will get to that later on. But they reintegrate a lot of the ideas that looked fantastic, but were very hard to pull off with technology back in the days. But now with CGI and with prosthetics, it's no problem to still do that. And so it builds upon something that was already in a certain way greenlit, Gamorrean Guards are green, by George Lucas. So I love that. Next, the rival gangs. This is something that totally escaped me. But the Nikto biker gang that we see in the Book of Boba Fett actually is not just the only gang on Tatooine, but we've seen in The Mandalorian a similar gang, and some people even kind of mixed them up and they thought, are these the same ones as we saw in The Mandalorian? But those were called the Desert Demon Brawlers. So the Desert Demon Brawlers versus the Nikto bikers. I love that there are all these different gangs. And you know what? There is actually a strange name for these bikers. They're not just called the Nikto bikers. But if you go to IMDb, you will see in the cast list, and this is not in the credits of the episodes, strangely enough, but the actual biker is called, the main biker, who is, so violent in the scene at Tosche Station, is called the Nutcracker Biker. The Nutcracker Biker. Is that just because this episode was aired around Christmas time or in the Christmas season? I did some research. I was like, where does his name come from, Nutcracker Biker? But apparently, what I think is they just typed in Christmas and bikers or something like that. And if you type that in, you will find a lot of images of a wooden nutcracker puppet or Christmas ornament designed as a Harley-Davidson biker. So it's not the classic nutcracker puppet, but instead it's a biker but has the same elongated face and everything. So I think it's just kind of like an inside joke. Like, we'll just take this weird Christmas ornament and just call these guys the Nutcracker Bikers. Crazy, right? Anyway, another thing. The actor who plays that main, the leader of the biker gang, Alan Bagg, also plays the Pyke Traveler. So the leader of the Pikes. It's the same actor, of course, playing different roles and wearing different prosthetics. That was pretty cool, and he's mentioned in the credits, thankfully. What else? The train scenes. That is absolutely, in terms of action, in terms of visuals, my favorite scene in the entire episode. It is incredible that we get to see this kind of action. That I said it before in my analysis, looks better than the train sequence in Solo. And, well, maybe it was inspired by the train sequence in Solo, but it is even more inspired by classic Western movies. Of course, Star Wars is very much a space Western. That is also, I think, why the element of the Native Americans now being the Tusken Raiders works so well. It fits with the overall idea of Star Wars as a, in a certain way, a space Western movie. But these, the train scene visually, and this was new to me, is actually inspired by a number of sequences in the famous movie Lawrence of Arabia. There is an attack on the train, and it's actually important because Lawrence, he is also, just like Boba Fett, trying to unite small tribes in the area to come together and to attack that train. And you remember that one scene where the Tusken Raiders are coming down the hill, and then you see the what is it, speeder train or whatever it's called, in the distance, derailed as it were? That is an exact copy of the scene in Lawrence of Arabia. And there's another scene also in the second chapter that mirrors another scene in Lawrence of Arabia, and it's when Boba Fett comes back from his dream sequence or his vision quest. I'll get to that later. And you see his silhouette shimmering in the heat. There is a scene in Lawrence of Arabia that is visually exactly the same. I love it that Star Wars is paying tribute to this, one of these great movies of classic Hollywood. And also pretty cool to pull that off, to actually do something that visually immediately evokes Lawrence of Arabia. It's just been years since I last saw that movie, so I totally forgot about that. That is why I love having a comment section, right? Wordle92 says this whole train sequence also, to me, immediately evoked Mad Max Fury Road. And yes, indeed, that was also one of the things I think I said while I was doing the watch party. Like, this is very Mad Max in terms of visuals. The audio, I have to say something about the audio of the train sequence. You remember the first time we see the train approaching in the distance? We don't know what it is yet. You see some dust clouds and everything, and then you hear a sound, and to me immediately it sounded like a krayt dragon. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to see another krayt dragon. How cool is that? And then it turns out it's a similar sound, but it's not a krayt dragon. It's a technological version of a monster. It's a train, a train that is weaponized. And again, you've got this whole deliberate juxtaposition of nature, krayt dragons, and then technological equivalents of that. The train, also like a metal dragon, wreaking havoc in the environment. And there is also an historical precedent for what happens next when the train approaches. Remember, all these Pyke guards are shooting not just at the Tusken Raiders, but also, which is very sad to see, they're killing a lot of those bantas, these poor animals that have done nothing wrong, and they kill a lot of them. And this was actually something that happened when, in the 19th century, the train was introduced in parts of America, and this iron horse would travel through dangerous areas, and passengers would just shoot at buffaloes that they saw in the distance. And this was something they just did for fun. So a train would travel through these wildlands and they saw buffaloes. Hey, let's shoot some buffaloes. And they would just kill them in exactly the same way as the Pyke guards are now killing off those poor banthas. According to some, this was actually even so bad at one point that it threatened the future of the buffaloes. They wiped out so many buffaloes that it did great harm to their herds and to their existence. Let's talk about the Pykes. The Pykes form another crime syndicate. And we've seen them before. I had to kind of think a bit, where have we seen these guys before? And it was, of course, also in the movie Solo. So this chapter connects a lot with the themes in the Solo movie. The Pikes were in charge of the spice mines on Castle. They were actually heavily involved in drugs trading, and in a certain way, they were a crime syndicate, just like the Hutts formed their own crime syndicate. So Pikes and Hutts don't mix together. And this is why it's so cool that they came up with the idea that the train would be run by Pikes, because it clearly shows that the Hutts, or at least Jabba, is no longer in charge. And so what happens if one crime syndicate fades away, another crime syndicate sees the market and just steps in. And that is why we've never seen trains or like this, or Pikes in Return of the Jedi. It makes total sense because Jabba was in charge and he had so much power and leverage that he could keep these Pikes off his planet. Or his planet, the planet. And so it's very cool to see how, this is how subtle the writing is of this episode. You know, these Pikes have just stepped into the empty space left by Jabba and his minions. And there are also different factions of Pikes, which explains why the Pikes that we see in Solo look so different. It could be because they're wearing face masks. It's a bit unclear if the Pikes that we see in Solo are wearing masks or not. And certainly some of them do. Some of them don't seem to do that. But it could also be explained by the fact that they just look different. And that's also what the Chapter 2 does for the Tusken Raiders. We were always used to, you know, if you're a cosplayer and you want to dress up like a Tusken, there was one costume. You know, there are actually databases where you can look up how do I make a Tusken Raider costume. And there was one variant, one version. Now there are going to be so many other versions because we've seen that these Tusken Raiders actually have different attires. And there may even be a difference in rank, certainly, because you've got the leader of the Tuskens. He's got a different costume, also a different face mask. And then you've got the Tusken Raider who is training Boba Fett, and who actually turns out to be a female Tusken Raider. She's played by a female actress, a stunt double, and also a gymnast. And she was asked to play the role of this trainer Tusken. And she definitely has a different headdress in a certain way, different colors. So, yeah, I think the cosplayers, the Tusken cosplayers, are going to have a field day in the future. So, this was about the Pikes. Also, already told you that the actor who plays the Pike Traveler also played the Nutcracker Pike. The sanctuary, or the casino, or the bar, you know, for me, the costumes there are fantastic. This is so much an homage to what they did for A New Hope. And of course, in A New Hope, they had a very, very limited budget. And so a lot of the aliens that you see and that since then have all gotten their own backstory, a lot of them were actually taken from other movies. And they were just kind of dressed up a little bit differently, but they just used also that's why there is a werewolf in the original A New Hope. I think he's been replaced by another alien in the special editions, but it was just stuff that they had lying around, and so they just took it just to save costs. Here in these sequences in the casino, they of course have much more budget, and these aliens look fantastic. Also the Twi'leks, both female and male Twi'leks, are amazing. And I knew that Jennifer Beals was playing what's her name? Well, anyway, the one who's in charge, the Madame of the casino. But what I totally forgot was that she is the main actress of Flashdance, which was a movie from many eras ago when you guys were not born yet, but I was. I remember that. I was in high school back then. And I was like, oh my gosh, wow, what a journey she's made. And then oh, but wait a minute. She's playing this role of, what's her name? Zoe Landau in A Lie to Me, which is a television series that I really enjoyed. It's a bit like House, but then it's with a specialist who can tell if people are lying because of like micro movements that they make. But there's this character, recurring character, Zoe Landau, also played by Jennifer Beals. I think she's amazing in this series. Now, I was a little bit hesitant when I did my analysis about this mouse-like alien that we see. We see him, you know, in filmed from the front, and he's got this little weird nose like that. Probably shouldn't do that because of, you know, screenshots. But this mouse alien, I was like, wow, he looks a bit like the mouse alien that we saw in the original Cantina scene. And then, lo and behold, thank you, commenters. Thank you, other YouTubers who helped me identify that it is indeed the same species as who is called the mouse bat guy in the Cantina of Mos Eisley. This type of alien is called a Shadra fan. And the original mouse bat guy was called a KB and was actually a female. And there's a whole backstory that you can find in some of the novels. And I think isn't there a book called From a Certain Point of View? And you've got all these writers taking existing scenes from the original trilogy and then developing a backstory. There's also a whole batch of stories about the Cantina and these characters that you see for 2 seconds, and then they develop this fantastic backstory. And well, they honored that by bringing back that alien race here, but this time filmed from the front, so you can see the weird nose and everything. The Hutts. We need to talk about the Hutts, and I have to apologize to all of you for who English is their native language, because it's not for me. I'm Dutch, as you know. So I was talking about this Seaton chair. The Seaton chair. It's what I looked up somewhere, that you should call it a Seaton chair. And then young Lee in the comments said, remember these cars? You know, 2-door coupe or 4-door sedan? You may want to consider how that is pronounced. So I was like, "Doo!" You're so right. It's just a sedan. So, not Seaton. Forget about that. It's also called a litter, by the way. And I love that. And there was another YouTuber who said, well, you know what? Actually, they had repulsor technology. So these Hutts could have just floated like you do with a land speeder. But the fact that they actually force slaves or whatever to servants to carry them is a display of power. You know, no matter however we are, we can afford to pay these guys to carry us. We don't need that repulsor stuff. We're way too powerful for that. So I love that. It's like, yeah, I never thought of that. Of course they could have just used repulsor technology. There is it's just showing off, basically. Then, Black Krrsantan. This was the ultimate cameo in this episode. And, you know, these costumes are made by hand. Every strand of hair is woven in one by one. This is how they made the Chewbacca costume. I know a friend of mine is a cosplayer here in the Netherlands, and he made his own Chewbacca costume, and he told me how many months it took to put it together, because every strand of hair is made individually. If they did that for Black Krrsantan, you bet that he's going to come back. If only because it costs so much money to make that amazing costume. And I have to say, I went back to the comics because I wanted to see a little bit more about his backstory. And he looks so much more dangerous in the TV version. I mean, the comic book version is okay, but wow, they really upgraded his looks for this TV show. He looks way more fearsome. So I'm sure that they will bring him back. And I'm thinking, you know, I got a question from one of you asking me, are there any other important Star Wars characters that you think are going to be introduced as cameos or in a role in a certain way, just like they did with The Mandalorian, where sometimes just people that we already knew from canon or from the expanded universe suddenly appeared and we saw them for real. And I had to think about it, and I was thinking, you know what? Someone I would really like to see, and I think the fans would love it if they did, is a cameo by Dr. Aphra, which could also be a way for them to introduce the Empire. We haven't seen the Empire yet. So I think that is a possibility, that they will cast Dr. Aphra. And you know, Disney, they're always thinking ahead of the game, so it could very well be that, knowing how popular the character of Dr. Aphra is, they may think, well, you know what, we may develop a standalone series around Dr. Aphra, but then we can't just do that like that. Nobody knows Dr. Aphra yet. but what if we introduce her in this popular Boba Fett series, and then later on we can build upon that to expand it. This is also what is now rumored to happen to Qi'ra character in Solo. And of course, many Star Wars fans, I'm one of them, super frustrated that the movie Solo wasn't the success that everyone hoped. It did very well. You know, they definitely made their money back and then some. But it wasn't successful enough to warrant a sequel movie, whereas the movie was clearly constructed to be a setup for maybe even a trilogy. I even think that these actors are still under contract. So the fact that they signed up and they got a role for Solo means that Disney still has the ability to bring them back. How cool would it be to bring back Qi'ra and to give her her own series? I mean, it's an amazing actress, and she has a huge range. And this story of Solo, what it's set up, there is so much potential. They can bring back Darth Maul. They can build upon this whole idea of crime syndicates and show us off-planet. This is happening all on Tatooine. But they could take the same themes of these crime lords and everything and just bring us to other places. So I'm thinking, 2023, yeah, give us a TV series based on, the sequel story of what happened after Solo. And then, if they do that, they could even bring back an older Qi'ra in this movie. Why not? Just, of course, timelines are a bit... Solo happened a long time ago. I mean, Han Solo was still very young at the time. So she would definitely be much older than we saw her in Solo. But, with modern makeup and prosthetics, not a problem. So how cool would that... You know what? This is... I have not a grain of proof that this will happen. But as a fanboy, as a Star Wars enthusiast, I'm thinking, oh yeah, give us some of those cameos. Actually, this series so far has been very light on cameos. And I think they do that deliberately because they want us to focus on the story. This is about Boba Fett. So that, yes, there is fan service, but it is very, modest so far. And I like that, but still, give us some cameos. Anyway, Black Krrsantan, Nautilus 1972, again, reminded me that he also in the comics fought both Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, and actually was a colleague of Boba Fett. So he may even appear in the Kenobi series, who knows? That could be another way actually to make sure that the investment in creating that entire costume pays off. Maybe Black Krrsantan has already got an important role in the Obi-Wan series. Now that I think of it, that would be even cooler. All right, awesome. Let's talk about Tusken Culture, because so many of you really latched onto that and reacted and were so struck by this second chapter and how it acknowledged the Maori culture, the Aboriginal culture, Native American culture, and integrated that into the fabric of Star Wars. Nautilus says, this works so well because Star Wars is a space western in a certain way. I totally agree. Then Meekin said in the comments, Temuera Morrison is of Maori descent. He's a New Zealander. So I'm guessing that was a key factor in the interpretation and motivation of the character and his journey. And Temuera would be proud to tell that story, and he is actually. Meekin writes, I am also from Australia and married to a Pacific Islander, so a lot of this hit home, and I can't wait for the next chapter. Mido wrote, as an Australian, I was amazed at the similarities in stories told with the Tusken Raiders that I could relate to because of our Aboriginal cultures. And it was awesome to see. Glad you mentioned it in passing, but yes, I should have maybe expanded more upon that because it's fundamental, and it also determines the visualization of the end scene, the dance. Then VRS Broadcasting asks me in the comments, what do you think about this female Tusken warrior? Could she be force sensitive? And you talked about parallels between the Book of Exodus and the Book of Boba Fett. Is there a biblical parallel to her character? I had to give them some thought, and I was like, I don't think that this is well, the Book of Boba Fett is not an analogy of the Bible story. It's inspired by elements from it, but it tells its own story. So no, I don't think there is a direct Exodus parallel. However, the Book of Exodus actually has a lot of important, strong female characters. So people that think, oh, the Bible and church, that's all like very backwards and very, very male-oriented. Well, actually, these Bible stories often tell surprising stories of how important women are to the overall story between God and his people, of God and his people. So in the story of Moses, you've got the two midwives that actually don't carry out the order of the Pharaoh to kill all these newborns, these male newborns, but they protect Moses. And then you've got, of course, his mother, who first makes sure that Moses is, brought to safety by means of the river, and then later on gets a job at the court of the Pharaoh to actually take care of her own son. But nobody at the court knows that she's actually the mother of this child. So she's very important. Then you've got the Pharaoh's daughter, who's very strong, because she knows when she sees the basket with the child, she knows this has to be, she even says it has to be a Hebrew child. But you know what? He's mine. I'm going to take care of this kid. I will make sure that my father cannot kill this child. So without her, and she's working for the bad guys, without her, the story wouldn't have ended the way it did. And then you've got Miriam, who's Moses' sister, and she later becomes a prophetess, and she also plays a story. So yes, Exodus has some strong female roles, just as the Book of Boba Fett, thankfully, has a lot of strong female roles. Fennec, of course. And oh my gosh, the actress Min, what's her full name? Sorry, I forgot. She is a true Star Wars fan, and it's a joy to see interviews with her and Temuera. They did a whole bunch of interviews, even with small YouTubers. I was like, wait a minute, that German YouTuber got an interview with these guys? I've got more followers than he's got. Okay, Lucasfilm, if you're watching this, hey, if you have some time, just to call me, hey, we'll do an interview. But it's so great to see these two people that are so in love with what they do, and they're so enjoying the process of making the Book of Boba Fett. And I think the chemistry is totally there on screen as well. So Fennec, very cool female character, and I'm so glad that they expanded upon. The actress actually says that in a lot of interviews. She said, the first time I was introduced, I was killed off immediately. I'm so glad they brought me back and that I can do this. It's a dream come true. And gosh, I know. Then we have to go to the whole vision stuff, the dream. This I thought was just a parallel with the dream sequence on Dagobah, or the mirror sequence in The Last Jedi with Rey. About facing your fears, facing yourself, facing your past, your provenance, and then hopefully get a clue for the future. At least you have to go through this as part of the initiation. But there's actually much more to this. The way it is shown to us, actually comes from indigenous cultures that, especially in North America with the Native Americans, they had what they called a vision quest. And it was, like this sequence here, part of the initiation, about the journey from childhood to adulthood. And male children who were going through puberty and had to become, true adult members of the tribe, they would be encouraged to go on this vision quest, which, that's how it was called, which was supposed to be a supernatural experience in which you were trying to come in contact with your guardian spirit. This, of course, is an intuition that you also see translated in Christianity, where there's this idea of that, we are not just alone, we're not the only creatures made by God. You've got all the animals, etc., but also spirits. And some of these spirits, angels, are guardian spirits, guardian angels. So this is how you see this is what I love about Christianity. There's so many parallels with other cultures. And it doesn't mean that Christianity just looked at Native American culture and said, hey, we can use that. We can just steal that and we'll just give them wings and there we have our angels. For me, I would say it's the same intuition. It's what you see in so many different cultures, and in Christianity, it just crystallizes into part of the doctrine. But it stems from this same intuition. It's just part of how this world that surrounds us, and our intuition and understanding of the fact that this world is bigger than what we see and touch. So that is also why I'm so at ease with Star Wars, because it, in a way, reflects a lot of the same realities that you see in so many different faiths and cultures, and also in my Christian faith. It's not about, we're just stealing from one another. No, this is, we're discovering with one another what life is truly about. So anyway, Vision Quest. What the idea was that you would go to an isolated location, preferably into the desert. And there you would engage in prayer, and you would fast. You would not eat or drink. And that could take several days. And then in some cultures, they would even provide hallucinating means. You would smoke some weed or whatever, or a pipe. And then that would help you get into that state in which you are more sensitive to the supernatural. And then the participant, the one who would go on this dream quest, would look around for either an animal that behaved in a strange way, or an object, could be a tree or a stone that reminded them of something, could be a symbol or a metaphor or something. And then they would often take that animal or object and take it home to the tribe, or take the story of what they'd seen. If it's a dangerous animal, then of course they were unable to capture it maybe, but they would come back, and then the tribe would help them to interpret what they had seen in that state. Now you see the obvious parallels with this dream sequence in the Book of Boba Fett, where we have, in a certain way, also witnessed that same dream, which is a bit confusing and blurry, and you're like, oh, what's going on here? But then later on, we, as Star Wars fans, we form our own tribe, and we help each other to interpret. So we're doing the same thing in a certain way. It was like, so what would that tree mean? And did you see that second tree, which I totally missed? Sorry about that, but thanks to your comments, I discovered Algernon Radish writes, if you look closely, there are 2 trees in the dream state. And how do you interpret that? Well, my tribe of Star Wars fans in the comments says they may represent the branches that symbolize the lives of Django, big tree, and Boba Fett, the child, the smaller tree. And they were both born on Kamino. Remember, these trees are actually growing on what looks like huge waves, similar to the ones that we saw on Kamino. And there are bubbles coming from the ground. So it's like underwater or above the water. It's unclear, but there's a lot of water in the scene. So it's clearly also about the family tree. This was the word that I missed in my own analysis. These are the family trees of Boba. And his roots, it's both a connection, it's something that can bear fruit. A tree is a living thing, but can also suffocate you if you become a prisoner of your own family tree. And let's not forget that ultimately Jango Fett got killed because of his work as a bounty hunter, and he wasn't the perfect example for his son. And so in this dream, Boba Fett realizes, and that's how deep it is, you know what, this father that I venerated so much, and in The Mandalorian we hear Boba Fett talk about his father and how much, the honor of his father and these traditions, what that all means to him. But if he emulates his father too much, and he did as a bounty hunter, it may actually end up killing him or holding him back from his true vocation. So when he breaks those branches, it's also symbolically the small tree breaking free from the root canal, the roots of his father, and choosing his own future. So the branch that held him captive and that strangled him, or was on the way of strangling him, he turns that into a weapon to become his strength. And he chooses, this whole sequence of creating his own weapon is also symbolizing taking charge of his own future. No longer is his future determined by who he was in the past or what his father did. And so this is all about tradition, yes, but also choosing your own path in your future. And in that respect, I think this dream could speak to all of us. We all kind of struggle with that. We resemble our parents in good ways, and also sometimes in ways that we're not so happy with. And maybe our parents have had a super big influence on the choices that we made in our lives. And maybe there's been a moment where you felt that you had to step back from that and you had to choose your own adventure, literally. You had to go your own future, and that may have caused a lot of problems with your parents. And this is also a message for parents. Let go of your children. Yes, you give them what you can, but if they want to choose their own future, you have to let them go. Your tree is not theirs necessarily. So deep themes, and it's obvious that this is important when this happens in a transition from childhood to adulthood. That is the moment that you choose your own future, and that it's up to you to now forge your own tools based on the material that you've received from your parents and from your tradition. In faith, it's the same thing, actually. Tradition in faith is very important, but it can sometimes become something that suffocates you. Pope Francis talks a lot about that, how sometimes tradition can turn into something like a system of rules that is so rigid that nothing can grow anymore, and the tree becomes barren. Which is, these trees are not bearing fruit. The only thing you see in between the branches are these red lights, these dots of light. And at first I was like, eyes? But whose eyes are these? And the artwork, the pre-production artwork that we see during the credits gives us the answer. These are glowing eyes of Jawas. Why are there Jawas in this vision quest? Because the Jawas played an integral role in stripping Boba Fett of his past. Literally, in the first chapter, they strip him of his armor. They take away his identity. And the only thing left is this, he's nude, basically. Like any baby that is born into this world, like the children that parents bring for baptism, they are literally, everything is washed off by the water. Their life is a blank page. That is why when someone gets baptized, you always get a white robe or a piece of white cloth to symbolize that new beginning. And so the Jawas are part of that tree. They too, took away or helped in a certain way Boba Fett break the bonds with his past. And of course, ultimately, he gets his armor back. But they are in this dream because they're part of the process of growing into the new Boba Fett. Then we see in these scenes that most of them were taken from the footage of the prequels, except for one scene. There is this over the shoulder shot of young Boba Fett holding the helmet of his father, and he sees his old face reflected in the helmet. That shot was filmed anew. They actually cast another young Boba Fett, if you look at the credits or if you look on IMDb. And so, and the fact that we see the face of old Boba Fett reflected in the helmet, of course, mirrors the similar sequence on Dagobah, where Luke Skywalker sees his own face in the broken mask of his father, of Darth Vader. And it is this whole, you see yourself in the past, but it's also looking back at you. Who do you want to be? Yes, you are your father in a certain way, but you also are to be yourself. So there's this confrontation. Rey, when she looks in the mirror, she tries to see beyond the mirror, and the only thing that reflects back is ultimately her own face. It's her own. She is the one who will need to. There is no easy solution. There's not going to be an apparition in those mirrors, which I thought was going to happen, like a whatever, Luke Skywalker or Obi-Wan Kenobi, or telling her what to do. But no, it's just her. She will have to face her own future. And then you get that return scene, which I already said was inspired by a similar scene in Lawrence of Arabia. Then the Gaddafi stick sequence, forging his own future. Now, what I forgot to mention in my analysis previously, and probably you've heard this already elsewhere, is that the place where Boba is working on his Gaddafi stick is a copy of a painting by Ralph McQuarrie. And I remember that so clearly. I had a book when I was in primary school. I bought a book from my weekly allowance about Star Wars, and it also had a few of those drawings that Ralph McQuarrie made long before the movie actually got made. These drawings were commissioned by George Lucas because he needed some visual material to convince people to give him money to make A New Hope. And everybody's like, yeah, there's no way in the world you can make that sort of stuff. And it took all these years to finally make an exact copy of that painting, which for me as a longtime fan, again, is so validating to see that nothing that was developed for the original Star Wars was completely lost. It comes back and it still works. Like Ralph McQuarrie was such a visionary. Without him, Star Wars wouldn't look like the Star Wars that we know. And God rest his soul, what an amazing artist, and what a prophet in a certain way. He never knew that they would still use his painting as a source of inspiration so many decades later. It's fantastic. The other painting that I mentioned earlier is the one where the Tusken Raiders are sitting around a campfire at night. And I went back and looked at that painting, and of course that is obviously what inspired this final scene of this chapter, where there is this campfire and there's this dance. It shows a guy sitting on the floor. It shows also some other aliens. It's not just Tusken Raiders in that scene. But there's someone sitting on the floor in the foreground with a bald head. And as far as I can tell, it's not a Tusken Raider. But it's a bald guy who's sitting there. And I'm thinking, no way. That's Boba Fett. That's him. How is that possible? This artwork was made even before A New Hope. I was like, whoa. Oh, this is so cool. Maybe it turns out to be a Tusken Raider, but I'm thinking that is actually Boba Fett. This was a prophecy of what they would do decades later in this series. Then we go to the clothing ceremony. This too, of course, as I explained in my analysis, is something you see in many cultures. This getting new clothes symbolizes a new phase and a new mission in your life. The Maori people, I learned this from Angela in the comments. Angela, by the way, is the host of The Secrets of Star Wars, a podcast from my friends at SQPN about Star Wars, and they also do a podcast analysis of each episode, so go check that out in your podcast software. But Angela says, I've learned that for the Maori people, the color black represents the heavens and also the potentially of being. So it represents inner strength in a certain way, potential. The long darkness from whence the world emerged. So it refers to the initial darkness of creation, where God says there should be light. But it starts with darkness. So darkness is not just the absence of future. No, it's the beginning of the future. So after watching chapter 2, his black wrappings, his black robes become even more symbolic and fitting. This is all black as the beginning of something new, beginning of a new creation, a new Boba Fett. And so this is mirrored in the first chapter, as you remember, where these service droids are dressing him with armor, and the cinematography is identical. So that tells me that there are actually 3 clothing sequences in these 2 chapters. And they represent a different phase in the story arc of Boba Fett. The first one is when he is robbed from his armor, and what remains is his white jumpsuit. He has just been reborn out of the sand, in a certain way. The sand, water, his fist emerges from the dune sea, from the water. So, baptism, right? Escape from hell, from the tentacles of hell. Reborn to a new life. That is why his attire is white. It reflects or mirrors the baptismal robes in Christianity. The second attire is black. And it is an empowering moment. He has now been trained in the ways of the Tusken fights and whatnot. He's much stronger. He knows he has discovered his vocation in the vision quest. So he knows what he's supposed to be, not his father. No, he's going to be a different type of leader. He's going to free these people that are in a certain way enslaved, just like he was. And this new attire is a confirmation of his future role or his new role. And so this in Christianity would be the moment of confirmation. It's another sacrament, part of the initiation sacraments of the Catholic Church. They've got baptism, communion, and confirmation. Confirmation is the moment where you receive the full strength of the Holy Spirit. So it is an unction of the forehead, a prayer, imposition or prayer with the outstretched hands of the bishop. And it is all to give you a mission in life. That is why you often receive it at the same age as Native Americans go through this transition from childhood to adulthood. A lot of confirmation ceremonies are at the age of 12. When you go from primary school to secondary school, it's the beginning of adulthood. You receive the power of the Holy Spirit to give you this new start, this new opportunity, and strength to fulfill that mission. And then the third attire, the actual armor, is another ordination ceremony, you could say, where he's receiving the armor that he needs to fight the fight. And there is actually a passage in the Bible written by the Apostle Paul where he talks about faith as an armor. Faith can help you to be strong, to protect you, but also to help you protect others against the forces of evil. So armor is also a strong symbolic element of a lot of Bible stories. And in an ordination, I was ordained a priest, first of all a deacon, so like a servant, and then a priest. And you also are receiving new robes. So a priest wears different robes than a layperson or a deacon. And the moment you receive the chasuble, that is literally signifying new clothes, a new beginning. This is your armor. And a chasuble, of course, is not an armor for a physical battle, but it definitely is a type of armor for a spiritual battle, because that's what our lives are about. It's all about embracing the light and fighting the darkness in ourselves and in the world. Let's talk about the ending. As I said, the scene at the campfire is inspired by this Ralph McQuarrie painting, but there is also the dance, which is not in that painting. And this is what struck a chord with many people that have ties with Aboriginal culture or the Maoris or the Native Americans. Dance is a very important element in a lot of these older cultures. And let's be honest, also in our modern day culture, look at TikTok. There's a lot of dancing going on. So it's just part of all our cultures. Because dance, especially if you dance with several people at once, you mimic each other's movements. A lot of TikTok is about that. You mimic someone who's trying to do the exact same dance, and that is binding you. It's forming a bond. But in this case, the style of the dance is inspired very strongly by the haka of the Maori. And Tamara, being himself a Maori, has danced the haka. There are actually videos you can look up on YouTube where he does that. And it's a very important element. If you've ever watched the behind the scenes or the making of videos of The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movies, you see that the actors from Maori descent do these hakas before and after they film. It's a very strong statement of like, we are here together to pull this off. Yeah, I loved it that we saw this in... And that Boba Fett is leading the dance. He's the one who starts, and then the Tusken Raiders join him. Fantastic. How will this series end? In my analysis, I had a bad feeling about how this may end if this story continues to be inspired by the story of Moses. Because as I explained, Moses never reaches the Holy Land. Well, he reaches it, but he never enters it. He dies before he can enter the Promised Land. Will this also happen to Boba Fett? Why is this just, and we know this for sure, it's one season only, just like Obi-Wan Kenobi. No sequels. So, Sandra Archer writes, regarding the end of the series, Temuera Morrison said in an interview that we should have a box of tissues ready at the end of the series. So yes, they might actually probably go there. So what if they go there? I don't know how to feel about that. I don't know if I want that. I'm such a fan of the character of Boba Fett. And this series is already so good in 2 chapters. I wonder if it's going to be enough for me as a fan. But on the other hand, it would be a fitting end. And I think, you know, I was thinking about that. How, if they choose to go that route, how would they show that? And I'm thinking, Star Wars is also very much about passing it on to the next generation. The story of Boba Fett is all about the trauma of losing his father. Here in this series, finding a new family, and then maybe passing it on. Who would don the armor of Boba Fett once Boba Fett dies? Who would he pass it on to? And I'm thinking, this young Tusken Raider kid. Why did they give him so much prominence in the first chapter? Why does it begin with the kid actually beating up Boba Fett? What if, ultimately, well, they already are friends now. Boba Fett feels responsible. He saved his life and also, you know, kind of behaves a bit like a father figure to the kid. What if this kid is the one who picks up the helmet, tries it on, and becomes the next Boba Fett? I'm just saying, let me know what you think in the comments. Is that too far-fetched? I think it would be amazing. The credits. Always keep an eye on the credits because there are sometimes some gems. There are just 2 little things that I wanted to mention here briefly. I was so happy to see that Ben Burtt, the Ben Burtt, who did all the sound design for the initial Star Wars movies, he invented the language of the Wookiees, R2-D2's bleeps and bips and bops, the sound of the laser guns and everything, the hum of the lightsabers. None of that would exist if not thanks to Ben Burtt. He's an Academy Award sound designer, and I was so glad to see him back at work here for this series, because he's not always been involved. He did sound design for The Force Awakens, but then for the subsequent movies, as far as I know, he wasn't involved, and I always wondered why. He's such a legend. I spoke with him once in Denver during the first Star Wars convention, and I was a huge fan. And this was when there were a lot of actors walking there, and we were all like, I was trying to talk to some of them. But then I recognized Ben Burtt, and Ben Burtt was like this unassuming guy, and he was like a bit surprised that I recognized him. This was before, you know, social media and everything. So, and I told him how much I loved what he did, and it was such a nice conversation. He was so kind and a very humble man, but oh my gosh, such a legend. And I'm just so, I feel so privileged that I got to have a bit of his time, and so to see him that he was back on the job here, and he's actually named like Benjamin Burtt, like his full name. Awesome. He's only one of the few sound editors. There are a lot of other people at work. Of course, it's a gargantuan amount of work, but I think, you know, we hear a lot more of the Tusken language, so he could definitely be part of the people that you know, kind of developed this, because of course he came up with the original sounds, and then maybe also the sound of the train. That seems to me like a typical Ben Burtt thing to do that, to make it sound like the Krayt Dragon. And also, what else? There's one other sound effect where I thought this could be Ben Burtt. No, it escapes me. But anyway, I'm pretty sure that they brought him in also. Oh, the Wookiee, of course, because he developed the Wookiee language. So if we're going to see this Black Wookiee in the future, you need some more grunts, and yeah. makes sense to ask Ben Burr to do that. And then another name I just want to drop here is Justin van der Lek, who is a Dutch special effects specialist, and he's a great guy. He actually moved with his wife to pursue his dreams. He lived not far from where I live, but he was so enamored with Star Wars and special effects industry that he was like, oh, we're just going to move. I want to work in that industry. And so he worked for Star Wars, a lot of the Avengers, Marvel movies he was involved in. He worked on the Hobbit movies. He lived in New Zealand for a while, and I think he's now back in California. And he's getting higher and higher up in the ranks. He's now an additional visual effects supervisor. So, gosh, I'm so proud of him. He's such a great guy. So it's wonderful to see someone realize his dreams like that. All right, that was what I wanted to share with you. Again, my apologies. This was a bit on the long side, but when I apologized for my previous analysis, you all said, no, it's not too long. No, give us more. Well, here you go. 1 hour and 20 minutes. And all that based on these few episodes. These are great times to be a Star Wars fan. Thank you so much for listening to all my banter. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you like this, give it a like and make sure you subscribe to the channel. I will be back with you when the 3rd chapter drops. I will do another watch party live on YouTube. So if you're still up at that time, join me. If not, you can watch it later and sync with me. And then I'll do, on the same day, probably another spoiler-free review, because I noticed that a lot of people enjoyed that like short format review, first impressions, and then I will do an in-depth analysis, probably also followed up by an episode like this where I just talked with you. We were just chatting about this episode and what it means. So again, thanks. May the Force be with you, and see you soon.